So for this project, I'll be briefly discussing the wrongful conviction of Termaine Hicks. Briefly going over the agenda here, I'll cover a quick background of the case, which includes the facts and timeline of the case. I'll also go over some of the critical issues that came up over the course of the trial of Termaine Hicks. I'll also specifically look at this case and critique it with the radical critique of law. A lot of the statutes that were brought forth against Hicks were from the state level as opposed to a federal level, so I'll view that in the context of law and social control. I'll also look at this case specifically through the lens of the critical race theory. And finally, I'll incorporate some of the views of Karl Marx and his ideas of law from a sociological perspective, and then I'll do a brief conclusionary slide summing up some of my final thoughts and briefly covering what I went over. So quickly going over some of the facts and timeline of the case, at approximately 5 a.m. on November 27th of 2001, a 39-year-old woman was attacked and sexually assaulted, who went by the initials WL. At 5:01 a.m., a witness that lived across the street from where the attack occurred, Justin Vada, called the police, and at 5:06, officers Martin Vinson and Dennis Zungalo of the Philadelphia Police Department arrived on the scene, where they would later testify in court that they saw Hicks sexually assaulting WL, and they would then further claim that Hicks was in possession of a firearm, and he would then lunge at officers, resulting in the officers needing to shoot Hicks. On the day of the incident, Hicks was actually shot 3 times. However, one of the key things that the officers testified to was that Hicks was facing them as they shot him, hence why he lunged at them and had the ability to lunge at them because he was facing them. However, this would become a point of contention over the course of the trial because Hicks would claim that he was shot in the back and was not facing them. Anyway, that was all covered on October 31st, 2002, which was the day that Hicks's trial began. However, on November 8th of 2002, Hicks was found guilty of all 4 charges by a jury that were brought against him. However, Hicks would attempt to file to overturn this. He would attempt to file a motion to overturn this conviction, as new camera evidence was presented to his defense attorneys that had the chance to raise reasonable suspicion as to whether Hicks was actually the criminal that assaulted WL, but the judge would later deny this motion, stating that the camera was not relevant enough or would disprove Hicks's involvement enough to warrant starting a second trial. And then on February 27th of 2003, Hicks was sentenced to 12.5 to 25 years in prison. So looking at some of the critical issues that arose in this case, Hicks only ended up becoming the guilty party here due to official state misconduct that occurred over the case of the investigation and the trial. The 2 officers, as well as a third that remains unnamed, officers Martin Vinson and Dennis Zungalo, falsely testified under oath in order to sort of frame Hicks for his involvement in this crime. Going back to what I said previously, they testified that Hicks had a weapon. However, at the time, the gun that they found on his body was not registered to him. It was actually registered to an off-duty retired officer. Furthermore, there was blood on the gun, and the officers claimed that they found the gun in Hicks's pocket. However, there was no blood on the inner parts of Hicks's pocket, so the gun could never have actually been in his pocket. So the officers falsely testified in order to sort of save their own skin. The state also withheld critical evidence in terms of that camera evidence that showed Hicks not actually sexually assaulting WL, and rather supporting Hicks's own claims that he was there to support the victim and try to help in any way he could. And the state withheld this in the initial trial, calling it an oversight. And then once Hicks finally got his hands on it, the judge then denied the motion to even have a second trial with this new evidence. So those were really the critical issues. So finally, now looking at this in terms of law and social control, Hicks was charged under 4 state-level statutes that included rape, aggravated assault, possessing instruments of crime, and terroristic threats. The reason why this is at a state level is because while rape is illegal in all 50 states of the United States, each state has the ability to define rape on their own terms, as well as some of the punishments that are associated with rape. The same can be said about aggravated assault as well as possessing instruments of crime. So all the statutes that were brought up against Hicks were at the state level. And that can be seen as well through the fact that his initial trial was held at the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, as he was charged under he was charged under Pennsylvania law, where he would then be sentenced to 12.5 to 25 years in prison. So critiquing this sort of case here, the radical critique of law, some of the core tenets of this sort of critique is that law is inherently oriented toward the preservation of the status quo. Law furthermore contributes to categorizing people in terms of their perceived differences, which can reinforce prejudice, discrimination, and misunderstanding between the state and citizens. And clearly this happened in the case of this trial as Hicks was pitted against the police that were falsely testifying. Furthermore, law creates confrontation between citizens and the state. This was definitely seen in this as the police ended up shooting Hicks, and they would then falsely testify that he lunged at them, which made the police fear for their own lives, therefore justifying the shooting of him. And finally, the law perpetuates injustice, can foster conflict, and will promote selfish interests. And we saw this as the police promoted their own livelihoods over that of Hicks. Now, looking at this from a critical race theory, this theory was somewhat derived from critical legal studies. It was based on the premise that people of color are treated uniquely and differently in the legal system. And furthermore, sort of a subset of the theory is that critical race realism attempts to draw on the social sciences to expose racial bias in law and document the harmful consequences that come about from that. Termaine Hicks, in this case, was an African-American who was wrongly accused and convicted of a crime that he didn't commit. And the fact remains that he may have been treated differently in that initial confrontation had he been a white person. The cops may have assumed that that man was there to help as opposed to immediately assume that he was the one committing the sexual assault. Finally, looking at the sociological perspective in Karl Marx here, Marx regarded law as a reflection of the material conditions of society, where he would then further point out contradictions in the law. And while that claims to protect rights and promote justice, but in actuality it's complicit in sort of preserving privileges and denying the majority of people fulfilling lives. And this was sort of his instrumentalist interpretation of the law. Now clearly this can be seen in the case of Hicks, because his rights were not actually protected, even though the law claimed they would be, and rather they were the privileges of the police officers were protected and preserved over those of Hicks, which denied Hicks the ability to have a fulfilling life since he spent so many years in prison. However, Hicks would eventually be exonerated on December 16, 2020 through the help of lawyers at the Innocence Project. They were able to get a judge to review some of the camera footage. They also brought in expert witnesses that were able to prove that Hicks's testimony was accurate and the police officer's initial testimony was false. So yeah, clearly looking back at some of the critical issues, as I just mentioned, false testimony and withholding of evidence by the state contributed to Hicks's initial conviction and time spent in prison. I covered some of the statutes that were derived under state law, which were used to convict and arrest Hicks. I also critiqued this case from the radical perspective and brought in some critical race theory. And then to add a sociological perspective, I discussed Karl Marx.